Welcome to this special presentation here on the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in New York. Today we'll be offering a unique presentation and exercise in sense-making that looks at the parallels between the COVID-19 narrative and the 9/11 narrative, two events that undoubtedly have had a huge impact on how our society functions as well as collective consciousness as a whole. Anytime we actively engage in sense-making, we have to look at the multiple layers that make up what is happening in our reality. This includes things like facts, the human condition, culture, how we make meaning. All these sorts of things make up how we make sense of what's going on around us. In this presentation, we are going to be focusing on the facts and the evidence surrounding both of these major events and how they may have been ignored in a larger societal conversation. By nature, we'll also examine how this has impacted our collective culture as a whole. Today we'll have two presenters. First will be Richard Gage. He is an architect of 30 years from the San Francisco Bay Area, a member of the American Institute of Architects, and the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He is now independent, however. He, along with his courageous wife and assistant Gail, continues to lead the charge toward a real investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11, with 8 video podcasts per month on Richard Gage 9/11 Unleashed, periodic conferences such as 9/11 Con and the 9/11 Truth Film Festival, a dozen TV and radio interviews, and multiple speaking engagements per month. He has delivered the live multimedia presentation 9/11 Blueprint for Truth more than 600 times in dozens of foreign countries and 110 American cities to audiences of 100 to 4,000. He has also appeared in more than 600 radio and television interviews. Next, we will hear from Dr. Madhava Setty. Dr. Setty is a board-certified anesthesiologist and has held various leadership positions in his clinical practice. Prior to his training in anesthesiology at the University of Pennsylvania and medical education from Baylor College of Medicine, he spent 6 years in the aerospace and defense industry as an engineer. Dr. Setty also holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from MIT. He is the author of a book, Woke, An Anesthesiologist's View, a systematic examination of the breadth and depth of the bias that exists in the media, our trusted scientific institutions, and our own minds. So without further ado, let's begin. I want to welcome both of you guys to the show, and I have a question to kick things off. Richard, we'll start with you. Is there anything that you feel differently? I know both of you have been looking at 9/11 for quite some time, but is there anything about this year, this anniversary, that makes you feel a little bit different about 9/11?
Yeah, this is pretty exciting. I have emerged from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, where I was the CEO for 15 years. Now I've started a new organization, richardgage911.org. We're reaching out everywhere. We're hosting a film festival on September 11th at richardgage911.org. We've been hosting podcasts, about 75 of them so far, beyond just the World Trade Center. So yeah, I've been the number of interviews that I've been asked to do has doubled. So I'm very excited, and I see an openness on the part of people to 9/11. And I'm thinking, Joe, that comes from the work that's been done by so many brave people like Dr. Madhava Setty, who are speaking out now on the ravages of the media's and the government's false narrative on COVID.
Well said. And Madhava, how about yourself? Any different feelings going into this anniversary?
Yeah, the feeling is a lot different. Joe, you and I have done 9/11 specials the last 2 years. And this year, compared to those two, I'm much more hopeful because people have started to see what's transpiring right in front of them right now. 2 years into the pandemic, 2.5 years, nothing's making sense. And ultimately, I think we're starting to see that we're being lied to. And if you're being lied to about something as big as the COVID pandemic, we could have been lied to about 9/11. And if we were lied to about 9/11, we certainly could be being lied to about COVID. So I really feel like there's a synergy here, and that's why this conversation is so important. It's one that I've been wanting to have with Richard for a long time now. It's been 3 or 4 years of talking to Richard offline, pointing out the fact that 9/11 is part of a bigger picture, and that picture is starting to reveal itself with this pandemic. So I'm hopeful. And Richard, thank you for all the work you've done for the last 16 years. You really gave me a place to um, reclaim my sanity when I thought that I was completely losing it. So I owe you a deep gratitude.
Oh, thank you, Madhava. And it doesn't hurt to have 3,500 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation of 9/11, and now thousands of doctors demanding a real investigation of the origins of COVID, its nature, its true nature, and the solution that we've been provided by our government, media, and medical industry.
Hmm. I think just with that, I mean, we're already beginning to see some of the parallels here. But, it's been a long time since 9/11 and some of the evidence. I mean, so many of us have been so focused on COVID-19 for the past couple of years, which serves right now as a time to say, let's start diving through some of the evidence that really sort of surrounds the key evidence that surrounds 9/11. And Richard, I know you have a presentation prepared. Why don't we kick things off with some of that key evidence?
Oh, you bet. And there are indeed, Joe, two events that radically changed American society, politically, culturally, economically, geopolitically. And that is 9/11 and COVID, of course. The question we have to ask ourselves is, were these intended outcomes? Or did they just happen as a result of these occurrences that we were unprepared for? If the answer is yes to the first question, then wouldn't that be the single most important problem for us to solve as a society? I mean, that would indicate that these were planned events. So to find out more, what we do is look for patterns. We connect the dots. We ask a whole lot more questions, much more deeply and fearlessly. So if these are planned events, then people would be aware of them before they happen, and we would have clues to that awareness. And one of the things that we know about these kinds of events that are called false flag operations, where one country attacks itself, blames it on another country, manipulates its people emotionally to support a war against that country. We'll come back to that. But one example of foreknowledge is drills, another insider trading and predictive programming or foreshadowing of the events. So if we have another, by the way, is an elusive, powerful enemy that you just can't get a hold of, creating a climate of fear. Do we have this set of dots to connect between these two major events? Is there extreme control of information and practices by powerful state agencies? Is there an abuse of science? Are the responses to these events far more harmful than the original problem? Was there a real investigation of the events? Are there false official accounts that are put out? Is there media censoring? Is questioning allowed? Or is it inhibited? Is there a manipulating and shifting narrative? Are there serious conflicts of interest with suspicious benefits for insiders? Are there the implementation of draconian policies and surveillance? Now, the beauty of these parallels came to me from Kevin Ryan, who developed them. initially, and he did an exceptional job in a presentation about a year ago, and I was just astounded. I had to pick it up and add to it and make more of it because it's so profound, as we talked about earlier, for our society. If the events of 9/11 and COVID show all these patterns then together and interactively almost, then how big is our problem? And where do we start to begin to uncover it and fix it? Well, 9/11 is what I think the big red pill opportunity is here. It changed our world. It woke me up and millions of others to the machinations of a deep, entrenched state. Now, we've been engrossed with the pandemic for 2 years now, and others on the order of millions are beginning to wake up. So we circle back to 9/11 now as a point of reference, since it's absolutely germane to understanding the whole. So let's dig into what really happened on 9/11. And there's no better place, I think, to start than the smoking gun of 9/11. The third tower that was destroyed at the World Trade Center. World Trade Center Building 7. Maybe you didn't even know that a third tower was destroyed. I mean, this is the third worst structural failure in modern history, and yet most architects and engineers know nothing about it. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects. We didn't receive one bulletin on this incredibly unprecedented event. And we go to architecture and engineering conferences. We show at our evidence booth the building coming down, as you're about to see, and the attendees are incredibly shocked when they know that this 47-story skyscraper drops like a rock in the exact manner of a controlled demolition. And it happened on 9/11, and it's not a twin tower. So we have not only censorship in the academic professions, but we have media censorship. We haven't seen the collapse of this building on mainstream media, with one or two exceptions. Here's Building 7. It's half the height of the Twin Towers, dwarfed by the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were built. About 1973, Building 7 came along in 1986 or so. Architect was Emery Roth and Sons. Structural engineer was Irwin Cantor. It was the tallest building in most of our states, even though here in Manhattan it looks like a shorty. So it's about 100 yards, a football field away from the North Tower. And it sustained some damage when the towers came down that morning. But NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked with explaining these collapses to the American people, admitted that this damage was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. So here it is standing just fine after the towers came down. And then at 5:20 in the afternoon, this happens. There's a few small fires in this building. We don't see them in this picture. But the east penthouse collapses, followed by the overall building. Now I want to point out that the east penthouse collapsing 6 seconds before the overall building is an isolated event. Obviously, there's nothing underneath it that would indicate that this is a collapse starting way down in the building, as claimed by NIST. The other thing we want to point out here is that the rest of the penthouse structures on the right side and in the center fall only a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building, indicating that the 20 core columns underneath them collapsed all at once. This is extremely important because, as you'll see, NIST tries to tell us that this collapse started on the left side, way down about the 13th floor, and traveled laterally across this building in 10 seconds or so. But what we can see now is that the entire core structure, absent 4 columns on the left, collapses only a half a second prior to the perimeter columns. And that indicates that we have a level of precision here unachievable by the cause of this building's collapse, indicated here by the project leader of NIST, Shyam Sunder.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
What? Fires? This hasn't happened before. Is this a real account? Well, let's see. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. And as you can see, they're relatively small, scattered, and not very hot throughout the building. They're burned out, in fact, on the floor that NIST says is the collapse initiation about 4 o'clock. We'll see. We have no precedent for the collapse of steel frame fire-protected buildings by fire. And there's been up to 100 much hotter, larger, and longer-lasting fires in these buildings. So this is an unprecedented event. So it should require the most advanced and sophisticated and extensive set of evidence to prove that that's what happened. What we have is the reverse. Take a look at Building 7 on the left, a set of controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame fire-protected structure, high-rise structure at all, ever. So we're going to examine what we have in the way of features of controlled demolition. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually near the base of the structure. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. This is due to the patterned removal of column supports by shaped cutter charges, typically. And we have a freefall acceleration, often because the thousands of tons of structural steel was removed. So it falls straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, resulting in also the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. There's limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. There's patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. The concrete is broken up, the floors. The explosive charges are visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry, or isolated explosive ejections. There's chemical evidence left behind of explosive charges. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create any one of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and eyewitness accounts, experts agreeing, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion as to whether this was a controlled demolition or not in any particular case. Video documentation. This is all proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we match up to Building 7 and see if we have any of these features, such as a symmetrical collapse. And let's take, we saw indeed that it came down pretty symmetrical, pretty straight down. Well, how do you do that? In the controlled demolition industry, you have to remove the core columns and followed by the perimeter columns about a second later. And that's indeed what we saw. And the question is, does the fire or fires in these buildings, in this building, have the precision to cause that symmetricality, taking all the columns out on every floor within a second between the core and the perimeter? Not really. So the question you have to ask is this the abuse of science. Let's listen once again to Shyam Sunder.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Well, is that true? Are there witnesses? Was this a real investigation? Let's listen to a couple of them.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that.
A second later, the bottom floor caved out, then the building follows. This is pretty incredible corroboration of what we saw in the videos, and which is evident by these other witnesses.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman who didn't realize that Building 7 had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. He and Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, went into this building believing that they had a meeting on the 23rd floor of the Emergency Operations Center, and this is their experience inside the building.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs like this heard by these firefighters nearby Building 7 in the late morning of 9/11. In this case, after at least one of the towers collapsed.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay. All right, here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
No witnesses of explosions. They claim to have interviewed 1,000 witnesses. I think they forgot about these, and they didn't forget about the 0.6 magnitude earthquake that was picked up that they attributed to the collapse of Building 7. But in fact, the collapse of Building 7 didn't happen for another 10 seconds. So this can't possibly have been caused by the collapse of the building. Corroborating the witnesses, we have, in fact, the evidence of explosions well before the collapse, which NIST tries to explain away with the collapse of the interior. But we saw indeed that didn't happen because the interior only collapsed a half a second prior to the exterior. The question we have to ask ourselves is, again, in a planned event, is there foreknowledge? Listen to these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are walking back. It's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? What did Kevin McPadden witness? We heard explosions before, but listen to this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
And then he heard those explosions. He's listening to a radio in the hands of a Red Cross worker. What's going on here? The BBC knew about the collapse well before it happened. In fact, they announced
now,
it.
More on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. What we have is the foreknowledge in many different accounts of the collapse of Building 7. It's still standing behind her. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What's really going on here? And are these false accounts that are put out, that are mistimed in this case? Well, with Building 7, we've had an opportunity to very briefly give you a sampling of the evidence that we provide in our extended documentaries and webinars at richardgage911.org. What we've found so far is that we have 10 very key characteristic features of controlled demolition, and some very uncharacteristic features as well, I might add. This is proof of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any one of these features, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, eyewitness testimony, experts agreeing, etc. This is proof of controlled demolition relative to Building 7. Now we have to ask ourselves, if Building 7 is shown to be a controlled demolition, pre-planned, before 9/11, executed on 9/11, don't we have to ask ourselves, at least ask the question, is it possible that something similar could have happened at the World Trade Center? So maybe now we're willing to take a deeper look, given the smoking gun that we just looked at. I mean, Building 7, of course, wasn't even hit by a plane, and yet it came down. Was there a real investigation with regard to the Twin Towers? Well, the 9/11 Commission report was hailed as the premier investigation of what really happened. They were charged with telling the American people everything about 9/11. And yet they're mostly lawyers and politicians. There's no engineers. They said they were set up to fail. It's not considered to be the last word on the attacks, but only a beginning. The commissioner chairman, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, said in their own book about this event, Tim Romer says, we're extremely frustrated with the false statements we were getting. And this from the Bush administration, from the Air Force, and from the intelligence agencies. Max Cleland resigned, saying this investigation is now compromised. It's a national scandal. America's being cheated. The White House wants to cover it up. The attorney for the 9/11 Commission, John Farmer, says, I was shocked at how different the truth was from the way it was described. There was an agreement not to tell the truth to the American people. He says it's almost entirely and inexplicably untrue what government military officials told Congress, the Commission, and the media. Well, let's look at some of what is true, because in 2005, we finally got the oral histories released because Thomas von Eschen, the city fire commissioner, recorded 500 of his first responders. within a month to find out what their stories were before they became reshaped by a collective memory. Finally, the New York Court State of Appeals overturned the case and forced the city to release these testimonies, these transcripts, to the New York Times, and they actually published them. But we didn't hear about this. No, and it didn't come out till 2005 through a very fortunate legal occurrence from the Freedom of Information Act. Yeah, let's take a look at those. Well, Graham McQueen did. He found now not 118, but 156 of these first responders talking about sounds of explosions, hearing explosions, seeing explosions, being blown around the building by explosions. Let's look at a couple of them. There's 156 of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to hear a very specific order of events with regard to these testimonies. They're seeing, hearing the phenomena, feeling it before the collapse of the towers, not the collapse of the towers causing this phenomena. Take a look. Now listen, all of a sudden the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. What do these gentlemen know?
We started running, floor by floor, instead of...
It was like, as if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
There are dozens and more than 100 of such testimonies. So just multiply that in your mind. Is there extreme control of information, therefore, and practices by intelligence and other agencies, because we didn't know about these, and of course, censorship on the part of the media? Well, what does NIST say about this building's collapse? They say that the upper part drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. There's a few problems with this crush down, crush up theory. It violates Newton's third law of motion. You can't have two bodies colliding without equal and opposite destructive force. Indeed, it's like running a Mack truck into a Volkswagen, in fact. Who's going to win? The Volkswagen can't destroy the Mack truck even if you drop it on the Mack truck. The lightest, weakest part of a structure, indicated by only 3/8 inch thick steel members up there, that's all you need. It's a virtual pyramid. Can't destroy the rest of the cold, hard, intact steel below. At the top, we have these thin pieces. They get thicker and thicker as you go down. And until you get mid-height, you got 36 inches by 16 inches with 2-inch thick steel. And down below that, all the way to the ground, it gets almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches. And yet this was completely ignored by Zdenek Bazan of Chicago Northwestern University, who put out an obfuscated paper just 2 days after 9/11 with formulas that are actually correct, but input data which is completely fraudulent, and we get into that on our website. It's the abuse of science. And just look at it. Does it look like a collapse to you? Or does it look more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009 with upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying, molten objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds? When we put on a new set of glasses and see this evidence for what it is, not from the media, we come away with a very different perspective. We have complete symmetrical destruction all the way down all four faces of each building. Does that resemble a natural collapse? Especially when you have asymmetric damage from the airplanes, the fires, and the buildings which are beginning to tip the top part. Let's zoom in and see the leading edge of this destruction. What are we looking at here? Ask yourself, honestly. I'm seeing a dozen explosions in this looped video. Floor by floor. And yet, we don't see any of that from the government. We've been given an account that this is a collapse due to the airplanes which broke columns, started a fire, and drove the rest of the building down to the ground. But we don't see that in any of the photos or videos. In fact, the building is destroyed in the first few seconds. We'll look at that. But as it's being destroyed, 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the destruction zone, we have these isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry that have no relevance in the official account. So we've been lied to. Take a look at the left side in this repeating video of the destruction of World Trade Center 2, the South Tower. We're seeing dozens of those squibs simultaneously. The structure inside is being destroyed even while the upper part is falling. The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says look for shrapnel effects in your investigation of explosions. And that's exactly what we have, the complete shattering of the structural steel frame all the way down to the ground. They say look for high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown at great distances. That's exactly what we have. Shrapnel effects. The building's completely shattered, broken down to its original lengths of columns and beams almost completely. The NFPA 921 says also look for blast pressure wave effects. Well, what would that be? Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, as we see impaled in the skyscrapers around it and destroying the winter gardens 500 feet away. We can see those freely flying 4- and 8-ton structural steel sections in this series of stop action takes. And particularly this one, we have, back 2, 3, forward 2, 3. What are we looking at here? This is a lateral ejection. How does gravity work? Gravity works down. Something else is happening here with this at least 4-ton structural steel section being almost hitting the World Trade Center tower or going past it, the Tower 7, I mean. So what's going on here? Trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Guess what? Steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. And these are office fires. So how does steel get flammable? We'll take a look at that. But it seems to me we have a manipulative narrative that tells us that the building was crushed and that the evidence is ignored to the contrary. For instance, if that steel was ejected well outside the footprint, then, and we see it during the collapse of the building, ejected outside, what's crushing the building? The steel is 1/3 of the weight of this building. It's not there to crush the building. How about the concrete? Maybe it's the concrete, because in a pancaking collapse, as we're told this was, we have pancakes in a real pancaking collapse like this earthquake destroyed building in Mexico. In the Twin Towers, we have a 2-story pile of twisted miscellaneous steel and other metals. So where's the concrete? It's not down at the bottom. There's 100 floors of that made out of concrete, 4 and 8 inches thick, each an acre in size. What happened to it? Oh, it's being pulverized in midair. All the photographs and all the videos show exactly that. 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to fine particles like baby powder, 100 microns, and spread throughout lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area in a blanket 3 inches thick. Wait a minute. If the concrete is spread over 3 square miles, it's not available to crush the building either. This is at least another third of the weight of this building. 2/3 altogether not available. What's crushing the building? This is completely ignored by Zdenek Bazant, who claimed to have found the reason for the crushing of the building. He not only included the concrete and the steel, but multiplied it ×3 in his fraudulent paper submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers just 2 days after 9/11. This might just be called the abuse of science. Speaking of which, the report itself, produced by NIST, had 2 years and $20 million. They were tasked by Congress to explain the collapse of World Trade Center 1 and 2 and 7. Did they? They had 10,000 pages, and yet only 1/2 of a page on the events following the collapse initiation. What did they say? Hidden in their footnote 13 and page 82. They stopped at the initiation of collapse. They have no analysis about what happens after that. Nothing. There's not a real investigation here whatsoever. It was a cover-up, as was the treatment of the evidence, which the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says, preserve the evidence. The spoliation of evidence is a crime. We have easily the largest and perplexing structural failures in history going on here. 400 truckloads a day were carted starting just 2 weeks after 9/11 away from the World Trade Center, put in the landfill, and then put on barges sent to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. This is well before investigators, forensic investigators, could do a proper analysis of the steel. We call that also abuse of science. You can't do science when you don't have the evidence. Speaking of which, let's look at the rest of the evidence, because it's extreme temperatures that we're talking about here, documented by multiple agencies, which we see in the dripping molten metal held in the crab claw excavator here. We can tell by its temperature, its color, what its temperature is. Exceeding 2,500 degrees. Guess what? Jet fuel and office fires don't burn hotter than 600 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the jet fuel manufacturer, ME Petroleum. So we have a real discrepancy. Steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,800 degrees. So how do we achieve those temperatures with office fires and jet fuel? Impossible. But we have evidence as to where they came from. Certainly these fires, which are probably 500 or 600 degrees, NIST claims 1,800 degrees. They're still 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit short of what we have evidence for and other agencies produced documentation for. And surely these fires were extinguished by the mechanical action of the collapsing building. So what's the source of the metal dripping from a beam, according to this firefighter? Molten steel beams. Eyewitnesses of molten metal, a river of steel flowing, says who? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, not realizing that this completely violates and pulls the rug out from underneath the official accounts and reports put out by our government. I didn't even know concrete could melt, but here is melted concrete from World Trade Center 6. Concrete melts at 3,200 degrees. It's in the police museum. Fire temperatures so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, not realizing that this museum exhibit proves what happened there and shows the temperatures. As if FEMA didn't, they document steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett. Problem is, it takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. Where do those temperatures come from? Completely unaccounted for, but documented well, in this case by structural engineer Abulhassan Astani Asl. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, and that piece is from World Trade Center 7. FEMA actually put an Appendix C together in their Building Performance Assessment Team report in May of 2002. It's a metallurgical examination of the steel. It shows us what happened to the steel. Thank God they did a great job at Worcester Polytechnic University. What do they say? Never before observed. Intergranular melting, a solid steel girder turning into Swiss cheese, like you see from this piece of World Trade Center steel also. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation. Where does the sulfur come from? Liquid iron, that's molten iron. That's 2,800 degree Fahrenheit iron. And sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to the New York Times. And yet, NIST completely eliminated this report when they took over the investigation in 2002 and produced their final report in 2004. Nothing about this evidence. This is the abuse of science, to say the least, and it is a cover-up as well. So we have laterally ejected steel trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Where does this heat come from? Are you beginning to realize now? We've been given a manipulative narrative of a collapse by weakening of steel by fire, and then a collapse. But we have something else going on here, and it is also documented by yet another agency of the U.S., the U.S. Geological Survey. In their particle atlas that came out in 2006, they document numerous samples. They all have these curious, previously molten iron microspheres. Billions and billions of them. All the samples have that. What does that mean? That means they were previously very hot, exceeding 2,800 degrees, the melting point of iron. Why are they iron? We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. And why are they spherical? Because molten iron under explosive pressure turns into spheres, just like it's the surface tension of the liquid does that. But where would that come from? Well, here's a thermite experiment in a controlled environment where we have thousands of what look like sparks, but they're molten iron, and they fall and they become spherical due to the pressure. So we know that thermite can create this. That's what thermite does. It's used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. That's its purpose. What else was found in the World Trade Center dust? Well, a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen examined 7 different samples sent to them. They find in all of them these curious red-gray chips. Red on one side, gray on the other. They're liquid applied, fluid applied. So that's how they get dual layered. They're attracted by a magnet. So they thought they were paint, but why is it? Well, it has a high iron content. That's how that happens. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest of them. They do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find what? Iron and aluminum, the key ingredients of thermite, in all of these chips scattered throughout all of the world, scattered throughout the World Trade Center dust. Oh, they get real curious now. They zoom into the red layer 50,000 times. They find nanoparticles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets. nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is really incredible. We have organic material that it is sitting in this matrix of organic material. Organic material is used in TNT to provide blast pressure wave effects, knock things over. So here we have an incendiary thermite being engineered to become much more explosive. In fact, when they ignite these chips in a differential scanning calorimeter, they produce what? Molten iron microspheres with the same signature as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by the U.S. Geological Survey. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. There's no question. They're found even attached to partially ignited red-gray chips. So we have a series of reproducible experimental evidence that could be brought to bear because this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is extremely sophisticated material made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. The Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal published this peer-reviewed paper from these scientists, which documents that it's active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. So we know how the towers came down. It's not a question. But none of this was investigated by NIST. Did they have access to the dust? Did they have access to laboratories like our team of 8 international scientists did at Brigham Young University? Yeah. Did they preserve the evidence? No. Bill Manning, Fire Engineering Chief, Editor-in-Chief of Fire Engineering Magazine, cries out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. Do we have the abuse of science? It's pandemic throughout this investigation. We have 10 key characteristic features and many uncharacteristic features amounting to controlled demolition. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives and incendiaries. Fire doesn't create any one of these features, does it? With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we find that this is proof of controlled demolition yet again. So we're sitting left with the irrefutable, overwhelming scientific forensic evidence of the destruction by explosives and incendiaries of the World Trade Center. What do we do with that? We can see that it's easy to comprehend. You don't have to be an engineer. You can see that the millions in the 9/11 Truth Movement are not conspiracy theorists. So should we, since we found a real problem on 9/11, begin to look at the work of the doctors who are questioning the COVID pandemic and the response to it, and maybe cross-pollinate between these two sets of corroborating support for mischief at worst, evil probably, mischief at best, evil at worst. So we have to contextualize what's actually happening. There are broader implications of the managed inside operation that we've proven has to have happened here. Have the same strategies been deployed with COVID to keep the public misinformed intentionally? As an architect, I've been looking with professional rigor at the World Trade Center. I founded Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth 15 years ago. I'm now unleashed, if you will, and starting a new organization, Richard Gage 9/11, where I can begin talking about the manipulations of the deep state beyond the World Trade Center, because we have to tie these things together. It is so important to see these similarities. So I had to speak out about it, and that was at a huge cost. But it was well worth it. It was a huge blessing, actually, in disguise at the time. Now, having been working outside the narrow spectrum of the World Trade Center evidence, I can tell you that the big picture is easy to present when we tie these two together. And now, with the Pulse hosting this incredible opportunity, we can counterpunch with Dr. Madhava Setty, who specialized recently in the COVID side and has the medical perspective on these deep controversies in the last 2 years, dividing our country and indeed our world. So let's take a look at what we have developed over on the COVID side. Joe?
Yeah, this was a really well presented set of evidence. And as you said, I mean, so well, the evidence is pandemic throughout the course of the 9/11 narrative that needs to be questioned. There is evidence all over the place. And I want to take a moment to sort of acknowledge that, you know, in the world of 9/11, likewise in the world of COVID-19, there are so many, let's say, points or let's say alternative facts that muddy the water of the rigor that is going on by people like Richard, by people like Madhava on the COVID side, looking at, you know, what the scientists, what the doctors, what the evidence is actually saying. And I hope that so far we can see that we're carefully examining the legitimate evidence here, not just sort of fringe conspiratorial ideas. I really want us to set that aside for a moment and look at the rigor that is going on in this particular case before we move on to some of this deeper parallel discussion with COVID. Madhava, I'd love to know if you have any comments or thoughts on what Richard has presented so far.
Well, it's always fascinating to hear Richard say the same things, and each time he says them, I learn something new. You know, it's such a powerful, powerful demonstration of what scientific rigor will lead to if one is willing to do the research and stay curious in terms of being professional, in terms of being authentic with the pursuit of truth. So with what Richard just presented there, for me, it is impossible for an open mind to not stop and question themselves about what we've been told. I cannot understand how someone could hear that and not scratch their head just for a minute to say, well, hold on a second, is that really what happened? But we all know that people are out there that they don't stop. And what I found the most fascinating in the years that I've been trying to talk to engineers that are my friends, they understand Newton's third law. You know, that's something we learn in 12th grade physics class. There is no explanation for the explanation we've been given. Yet when it comes down to examining what we know about the building's collapse, these engineers, professional engineers, will just stop and say, oh, wait a minute. If what you're saying is true, that means our government lied to us. So they're more willing to abandon Newton's third law than their trust in the government. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that what we're dealing with right now is more than, you know, science and scientific experiments and the pursuit of evidence. We're dealing with psychology. And this is why it is so difficult. Sometimes, especially with people who should know better. And that being said, I would have to say that the COVID perspective on this is a lot more subtle. You know, we don't have flying beams being thrown 600 feet. We We don't have we don't have, molten steel, and we don't have all of these things in our faces. We have to look a lot harder, and the clues are more subtle, and we'll see what they show.
Indeed, and well said. And to fairness here, 9/11 has a lot of years on COVID in terms of the narrative and the ability for people to be able to look at this information so deeply and throw science at it and really take the time to understand it. So, over the course of time, COVID will probably become clearer as well. But, with all that's been said so far, there's this sense, right, as we venture here to explore the parallels between 9/11 and COVID-19 within the narrative, there's a sense that we have to ask the question, is there some sort of social engineering that is going on here? So to take that to the next level, Richard, why don't you begin by going through your section here on exploring the parallels between COVID and 9/11.
Yeah, because we just looked at the scientific forensic evidence, and it turns out there's a whole lot more evidence that takes us even deeper into this mystery of the false flag operation of 9/11. And so we want to dig deeper. And we mentioned before, if this event was planned, there would be people who would be aware of it in advance. We looked at a little bit of foreknowledge, but now let's examine why did we have 28 hijack exercise events within 2 years before 9/11, and what does that show us? And so we have actually 40 of them all together, and it's really incredible what they've done. They've prepared or paved the way here. We have beginning in the months before 9/11, we have in Pennsylvania, near Shanksville, by the way, the 600 local first responders and emergency managers for a toxic chemical agent, which we'll find it becomes very relevant. We have on 9/11 itself a number of drills on 9/11. Coincidentally, FBI training exercise in Monterey for anti-terrorist task force. We have NORAD annual readiness drill on 9/11. Vigilant Guardian drill on 9/11 with full battle staff levels to test the entire organization. On 9/11, live fly hijacking and air defense drills, hijacking multiplication, diversions, and confusion to the air traffic controllers who had false blips on their radar intending to be part of the exercise, yet confusing them. And their own recordings show exactly that. Is this real world exercise, or is this the drill? They didn't know it was that powerful. And the drills were not turned off until after the Pentagon was attacked. It's incredible. An hour before the Pentagon was attacked, this plane is flying toward it after the Twin Towers both collapsed. And yet the drills continued. It's incredible. Tripod 2 exercise we're going to go into in some detail. On 9/11, AWACS drills ordered by NORAD. And these AWACS were indeed above the skies of D.C. or New York. And they're fully capable of commanding and controlling an operation such as what we have come to realize. On the cover of some of these drills, Osama bin Laden, as if, they knew that he was, to be part of this effort, that he was capable of flying planes, even into buildings, as we have on the cover of yet another emergency response terrorism study guide here, the targeting of the Twin Towers. Now, Tripod 2 became a biochemical attack drill with hundreds of FEMA, police, fire department, and FBI in downtown New York. They were set up for this biochemical attack drill on Pier 92, ready on Monday to take over the event, which happened on Tuesday. Giuliani actually said publicly, it had hundreds of people from FEMA, the federal government, state emergency management office, getting ready for this attack, a biochemical attack, which, by the way, included anthrax, which becomes very interesting. The equipment was already there. We were able to establish a command center within 3 days, they say, but it was actually the next day. 2.5 to 3 times bigger than the command center that they lost at World Trade Center 7. Well, why did they lose their command center on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7? They didn't lose it until 5:20 in the afternoon when it was blown up. So they were clearly needing an alternative command center because they blew it up. Let's listen to this FEMA operative interviewed by Dan Rather.
Rescue worker with the National Urban Search and Rescue. It's part of FEMA, the Federal Disaster Relief Agency. It's Tom Kennedy from the Urban Search and Rescue team.
To be honest with you, we arrived on late Monday night and went into action on Tuesday morning.
Thank you for being honest, Tom. That is an incredible coincidence. How about this coincidence? Bush, Cheney, and staff were put on the antibiotic Cipro on 9/11. 5 days, actually 12 days ahead of the anthrax attacks. I think it was 15 days ahead. Well, that's pretty incredible. This is documented by Dr. Tubbs, the presidential doctor. And he said he gave everyone on that plane Cipro. Well, why were they giving them Cipro? There was a credible reason to believe, apparently, that anthrax attacks was part of the 9/11 drill. And so this started well before the anthrax letter attacks against congressional leaders. And so what other foreknowledge do we have? Insider trading. They risked everything in bets that the value of the airliners and the financial institutions in the World Trade Center would plummet on 9/11. That's affected companies, industries, and treasury bond trades, credit card transactions. This was an extensive set of bets by people who apparently weren't connected to Al-Qaeda. So the investigation by the 9/11 Commission documented insider trading, but they said, hey, this didn't involve Al-Qaeda, so we didn't have to pursue it any further. Wait a minute. Well, who did it involve? Is that not critical information for us? This is censorship, to say the least. What about the false official accounts relative to 9/11? The COVID side, Madhava Setty, our medical doctor, will be going into those. So that's why they are grayed out. But for now, what have we got? A myth. 19 fundamentalist hijackers hijacked these planes, caused the jet fuel causing the towers to weaken, the structural steel, and collapse. And a myth that the Pentagon was penetrated by Hani Hanjour, who failed Cessna flying school and flying around an hour after both towers had been hit, unmolested. Completely unbelievable. How about this next parallel? With an elusive, powerful enemy, hidden terrorists throughout the U.S. that could do massive damage with weapons of mass destruction at any time. Could be anywhere, even in your own neighborhood. Osama bin Laden at large in a cave in Afghanistan for a decade, eluding the most technologically advanced intelligence system in the world. The deadly, lethal anthrax hidden in letter attacks, also an elusive, powerful enemy, right? We can't see the viruses, and any of us could get a letter in the mail attacking us. This is a lot of fear that's being created here. In fact, the fear-based media propaganda was going on 24/7 following 9/11. The threat level code indicators looking and creating fear in the populace of the United States and elsewhere as it rose toward orange and red. And we were just kind of hiding in our houses, told to possibly get plastic and put up duct tape around our windows in case of a biochemical attack. So we're very compliant under those circumstances, because what they do is they not only create a climate of fear, they abuse the science. We saw the evidence of explosive demolition and the complete abuse of science by the NIST report, the FEMA report before it. The seismic evidence revealing explosions, hundreds of eyewitnesses of explosions not reported, not in the final report. Extreme temperatures of molten iron taken out of the report by NIST. Billions of molten iron microspheres and chips of nanothermite documented by federal agencies in the case of the molten iron microspheres, and yet removed from the final reports by NIST altogether. Another parallel. Is there a response far more harmful than the original problem? Well, we have 2 million Muslims murdered in the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. 7 countries were scheduled to be overturned, according to General Wesley Clark. 7,000 U.S. soldiers died in combat. More than 30,000 taken their own lives after service in these wars. This $6.5 trillion global war on terror that our children, our grandchildren will be paying for. A massive drain on our own U.S. Treasury debt, causing incredible levels of inflation. The consequences of 9/11, with the invasion of these countries, the global war on terror, the loss of civil liberties with the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, in which any of us can be arrested, tortured, assassinated. It's pretty bad. None of this was before 9/11. Now, we don't have a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury, if they accuse us of terrorism, which is defined as using force, which is undefined. So we have torture policies, the creation of Homeland Security, an emerging and powerful police state, as Edward Snowden has given us notice of and proof of, that we're all being recorded with our emails, our phone calls, our text messages, systematically scraped up, stored for use against us. This is completely unconstitutional. So we have the demolition of our constitutional civil liberties protected by the Constitution. So we have real problems. Is there another parallel? Well, was there a real investigation? We saw, no, there was no real investigation, but the 9/11 Commission investigation was in fact delayed by Cheney and Bush for a year. The family members developed at least 75 powerful questions given on a silver platter to the 9/11 Commission to ask of various witnesses. They didn't ask most all of them. And they didn't use subpoena power to force testimony under oath. And the report was not written by them. It was written by Bush insider Philip Zelikow. Well, Philip Zelikow developed his PhD thesis on the creation and maintenance of public myth. This is absolutely incredible. You can't make this stuff up. And the 9/11 Commission didn't really investigate. They didn't effectively use their power. They overtly sought, in fact, not to point fingers or to find crimes. That was in their charter. So nobody was going to be going to jail. In fact, nobody did. Nobody was demoted. Everybody, in fact, at key positions in this play were promoted. Was there censorship by the media and corporations? Well, the alternative hypothesis, the evidence that we presented, the theory that we proved of controlled demolition, has been ignored, dismissed, and labeled conspiracy theory. This is, again, pandemic across government branches, across media companies, and around the world. We're looking at a real conspiracy involving thousands of key players to pull off the execution, the planning, the execution, and the cover-up of an event like this. I'm looking forward to hearing Madhava's COVID side of this equation because it's even worse, as I've come to find out. Journalists claim to have debunked 9/11 truthers in the mainstream media, but they only attack straw man arguments. They don't present any of the scientific, forensic, and irrefutable evidence that we've been presenting. Only a small spectrum of, did we have time to do that today? The University of Alaska investigated Building 7, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. He found that it couldn't have come down by fire. It had to have been a collapse. It had to have been by the removal of all 80 columns in the building within a second of each other. Was this reported anywhere in the key academic institutions? Was it reported in the media? No. We're looking at a massive censorship dragnet, highly coordinated. In fact, how is that controlled? We have state agencies and administration controlling it in advance, like President Bush does. He gets a lead on it here.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
Wow, that was before they even began. Incredible. Let me go back and catch this one. In the lead up to the Iraq War, the U.S. government hired a major PR firm, Hill and Knowlton, to manufacture false stories like babies being thrown out of incubators by the Iraqi army in the hospitals in Kuwait, proven as completely false. And the actor daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador herself pretending to be one of those witnesses to this event. She was nowhere near these events, and they were proven to be false. So that's pretty incredible. There's lots of examples of these false stories. 10 years later, the failed fundamentalist Islamic terrorism narrative shifts. In yet another parallel, the extreme control of the narrative, shifting the narrative. Domestic terrorism is now the operative concern of the powers that be. We don't hear much about fundamentalist Islamic terrorism anymore. It's not cool. We've gone on to attack our own citizens who are politically not aligned with the power structure as it stands currently. Are there serious conflicts of interest with suspicious financial benefits for insiders? Well, indeed, Cheney is in control of Halliburton with billions and billions of no-bid contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Michael Chertoff, the co-author of the Patriot Act, interestingly, yet administering justice against Muslims who are tortured in Guantanamo while setting free Mossad operatives caught dancing as the towers were being destroyed. Michael Chertoff also profiting from the remote flight control systems developed, which we believe were used on 9/11. Financial crimes documented by the Corbett Report at corbettreport.com. 9/11 trillions follow the money. Billions in profits flowing to banks, defense companies, oil companies, and the media from the devastation in Iraq and Afghanistan following the instigating cause, the destruction of the World Trade Center and the destruction of the Pentagon, which caused Article 5 to be invoked by NATO, where the U.S. could then drag the rest of the NATO partners into Afghanistan and Iraq under false pretenses. The neocon think tank Project for a New American Century in a key, serious conflict of interest, where they posted on their website in 2001 their goals for regional hegemony in the Middle East, a vast increase in the Pentagon budget. But they exclaimed a year before 9/11. The process of change is likely to be a long one, absent a catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. And that's exactly what President Bush wrote in his diary. We had our new Pearl Harbor following 9/11. These PNAC individuals were brought into the Bush administration. These neocons from this neocon think tank. And they document exactly what happened. A catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Is there foreknowledge? Another parallel. And in this case, something a lot deeper with predictive programming, identified by Alan Watt as a subtle form of psychological conditioning provided by the media to acquaint the public with planned societal changes to be implemented by and where they will implement them and accept them as the public will accept them as natural progressions, thus lessening public resistance and commotion. And then per Dustin Broadbury, they're encouraged to swap concrete reality, the public, for static constructs until eventually our inherited worldview is replaced by mythos and archetypes. And you can see that at play in the feature films, cartoons, comic books, 61 examples of the Twin Towers being targeted and destroyed from as early as the 1960s up through 2001. As per the New York Magazine, where there's a real estate, 2001 is their life beyond the boom, showing the Twin Towers there and a tremendously fearful climate again being created. The Lone Gunman, a predictive programming telegraphing what is going to happen when Condoleezza Rice exclaiming, "We could never have imagined somebody hijacking a plane and flying into buildings."
Corner of Liberty and Washington, Lower Manhattan.
World Trade Center. We're going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
I'll tell the flight crew.
Lanley, can you override the flight control system?
I'm working on it.
So it was placed in the public consciousness, in this case, 6 months before 9/11, in this case, a year, in the late 80s, as early as that, where Neo's birth date is September 11th. Not his birth date, the expiration date of his license. We have so many examples. Spider-Man, attack on the Twin Towers. He's probably defending it. We have the Twin Towers destroyed in all of these comic books and computer games again and again and again. Even Muslims are brought to bear in 1994. They weren't even a threat in 1994 to the U.S., and yet this is put into our public consciousness. And look at the finger symbols also, by the way, highly symbolic. And so it doesn't stop. It went on and on and on. In The Simpsons, 9/11 on the right. We have all of these examples. So we have to ask ourselves, not only was the 9/11 destruction planned and executed, it had been pre-planned. The evidence seems to show for decades, certainly for several years prior. It's a major operation. It involved all of these examples of manipulation, abuse of science, etc., foreknowledge, that appear to be evident not only in the Twin Towers destruction and all of the events of 9/11, but appear to be, as we'll find out in a moment, operative in the pandemic. So I think that's absolutely extraordinary. It looks like 9/11 not only foreshadowed the current pandemic, but set us up psychologically to accept the degree of over-response, the control mechanisms, the fear. And here we go again. The stage is set for COVID.
And that's very well said with regards to, kind of how 9/11 may have set the stage for this in a number of ways, which we're about to get to. Madhava, why don't you just dive right in so that these parallels are fresh in people's minds as we go into the COVID side over here?
Well, Richard, thank you so much for that amazing presentation about 9/11. And as we're about to see here, the parallels are uncanny. And before I move into the material, I think it's important to acknowledge what Joe acknowledged before, is that we're still in an embryonic stage with regards to the COVID-19 situation. Things are emerging rapidly, and we'll probably know a lot more in 21 years, just like we know a lot more now about 9/11. And secondly, the evidence that I'm going to offer here is very subtle. It is not necessarily, huge beams being thrown, as I said before, and like obvious distortions of science. We're talking about very subtle things here, like gain of function research and virology and immunology and PCR testing and things that most people don't even understand to begin with. And there are no experts here. In order to be an expert on this, you have to be an expert in vaccinology, in immunology, in infectious diseases, in mRNA technology, in rheumatology. And once you start talking about vaccine adverse events, you have to be an expert in cardiology. So we're just going to go at this knowing that there is no expert with regards to everything, and look at what we can tell and what we can say without a doubt is going on. Foreknowledge of event. Was there a foreknowledge of the COVID-19 pandemic? Here we have Dr. Fauci warning us of a surprise event way back when in 2017. What did he have to say?
There will be a surprise outbreak. Given, as you heard from the introduction, that I have been around for a while and have had the opportunity and the privilege and the pleasure of serving in 5 administrations, I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today, is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge, the coming administration, in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
A very interesting statement from the good Dr. Fauci. He is predicting a surprise event, which is a rather paradoxical statement, to say the least. And he seems quite certain, saying that there's absolutely no doubt in his mind. Now, we have to be careful here, because we can say, holy moly, the man knew that this was going to happen. How did he know? But at the same time, one could make the argument that he's an amazing prognosticator. He knows more than anyone else, which is why he's so good at predicting the future. What else do we have with regards to foreknowledge? We have something called Event 201. It's a tabletop exercise performed in a single afternoon in October of 2019, just about a month before the very first case of COVID was detected in China. It was sponsored by the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Johns Hopkins, and it predicted and modeled every single step involved in detecting and containing a pandemic. In this situation, the event was remarkably accurate, uncanny accuracy. First of all, we see that it was a zoonotic coronavirus that they used, transmitted from bats to pigs to people. A little different, but no doubt it is a coronavirus of bat origin. How do they know? I don't know, but they were pretty good at predicting where it would come from, right? Modeled largely on SARS. Furthermore, going down to the paragraph that I've highlighted, there is no possibility of a vaccine being available in the first year. That was true. There is a fictional antiviral drug that can help the sick, but not significantly limit the spread of the disease. How accurate is that? I would say uncanny. What I'd like you to witness here is a video segment from the event. Now, what we're going to see here is an introduction by one of the MCs, and he will introduce a person who states what the current state is, and then they're going to introduce a news clip that demonstrates the kinds of issues that the world would be facing. And I wanted to show this clip because we're talking about the media here. How does the media talk about what's going on?
Okay, we will now advance 3 weeks to the fourth and final meeting of the Pandemic Emergency Board on December 18th, 2019.
Okay, thank you for reconvening, and let's get an update from Dr. Rivers.
In the last 3 weeks, case numbers have continued to grow exponentially. We now have an estimated 4.2 million cases and 240,000 deaths. Almost every country is now reporting cases, and those who aren't may simply not have the resources to conduct surveillance. We don't see any change in the rate of rapid spread, and models estimate that we could have more than 12 million cases and close to 1 million deaths by mid-January. We're not sure how big this could get, but there's no end in sight. Financial markets are universally down by 15% or more on the year. Fear of a catastrophic pandemic and uncertainty about the capacity for governments to respond and remain viable are fueling investor uncertainty.
Notice how she hit almost exactly what our media has been telling us. There's no end in sight. Deaths are going to be increasing exponentially. The markets are down. Everything that we saw at the initial stage of the COVID-19 pandemic was modeled just a month before. Now, check this out.
We have called this meeting today because of major strategic problems around communication that are happening globally. And here's a media debate that just happened on air today.
Alarming news emerging from social media companies today about the CAPS pandemic. Twitter and Facebook are reporting they've identified and deleted a disturbing number of accounts dedicated to spreading disinformation about the outbreak. For more on this, we go to our correspondent, Catalina Parks.
Chen, these accounts were created by several state-sponsored groups intending to sow political discord, and some individuals are seemingly seeking to gain financial advantages. Violence against healthcare workers and minority populations has been increasing. A recent riot highlights the real danger in these posts. Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How foreboding is that? The issue here is about the stopping the spread of misinformation. And did you notice how polished the video production is? This was something that must have been planned for some time before that day. How long does it take to put all this together? So we have to be very aware that, once again, this is an indication that there was foreknowledge, but it's very easy for those who trust our government to say, well, we need to trust what they're saying now because look how accurate they were in predicting what was going to happen. So this is why 9/11 is very, very important, because it gives us a means of focusing in on what really is. If we understand that those kinds of powers have the capacity and motivation to prevaricate and lie to the public, they're going to do it. How do we know that's not happening now with COVID? False official accounts. Just like 9/11, the event was implausible to begin with. And by event, I'm talking about the bat to human jump of a coronavirus that led to a global pandemic within a few weeks. There was no intermediary steps. It is not easy for a virus to jump from one species to another. It happens, but it happens incrementally. In other words, usually you'll find it happens once, it gets into a human being, and then either the person dies or the virus is incapable of transmissibility from a human host. And you find that there is an iterative process as the virus becomes more and more able to infect a human being and remain pathogenic. But in this situation, we're forced to accept the fact that this virus came from a bat into a human being, fully equipped to cause a extremely serious respiratory-borne illness and be transmissible to the point where it was able to cause a pandemic across the globe in just a few weeks. So the point here is that this is not the most plausible explanation for what happened. Next, we also have the Wuhan Institute of Virology right there at ground zero, and they were conducting gain-of-function research on the very same clade of coronaviruses. And now we finally have experts that recently admit that a lab leak is a more likely explanation. The former director of the CDC, Robert Redfield, said over a year ago that the virus most likely escaped from a lab. And more recently, we have Jeffrey Sachs, who is the chair of the Lancet's COVID-19 Commission, calling for an independent investigation. And he believes now that he's convinced that a lab leak is the most likely hypothesis. Now, obviously, if you mentioned this 2 years ago, you would have lost your platform. You would have been called a misinformation spreader and someone who should never be listened to again. But that's what we're doing right now. We have a shifting narrative, and the false official account is being shown for what it is. Abuse of science. Now, this topic pervades pretty much everything I'm going to talk about with COVID-19. For example, the lab leak, that is an abuse of science. And we're going to see that the abuse of science is rampant with regards to the COVID-19 narrative. Now, the idea that the virus came out of a lab was discredited early on. And this was the article back in March of 2020 that dismissed any possibility that the virus could have come from a lab. And the paper was written by Christian Andersen, who is a go-to person for Fauci. He is a well-known virologist working at the Scripps Institute, and he published this paper. And if you were to read the paper, it is very, very sophisticated. It's complicated. But the reality is, it is very, very difficult to say that a virus could not have been engineered. It's really, really hard. He seems to think, or he states unequivocally, that it could not have come from a lab. And the reason why this was, in my mind, the first evidence that the narrative was being falsified was that his reason was the following. He says that the virus could not have been of lab origin because his computer models suggested that the virus's spike protein was not optimally suited for binding with the ACE2 receptor. Now, what does that mean? He's basically saying, look, you take the virus, you look at the spike protein, and yes, it binds our ACE2 receptors, the mechanism and the means by which the virus enters our cells, and it works great, but it could be better because our computer model says that it could be better. And obviously, any bioterrorist, for example, would have picked what our computer model picked. That in and itself is an absurd idea. If you were trying to hide the possibility of your shenanigans, why would you pick the optimal solution that the computer or computer models predict? You wouldn't do that. You would definitely not do that. And the point here is that, yes, we're speculating, but the logic that this accredited virologist uses is a clear indication that there is misdirection going on. That cannot be denied. What's interesting here in terms of the parallel with 9/11 is, I would say, and maybe Richard would agree with this, that the biggest blunder, if you will, by NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, was to not look for evidence of explosive residues. That was like scientifically the most ridiculous maneuver. And because they didn't look for that, makes their entire presentation and research questionable, because that's the first thing they should have done. And in this situation, this is the early on repudiation of the real idea that the virus came from a lab was made by this blunder in logic. Very, very interesting. It happens early on, before real research could be done into the topic. Here's what's fascinating. Around the same time, we have a paper that came out in The Lancet. The Lancet's going to appear a lot in my presentation here because The Lancet seems to be involved with creating a false narrative. And The Lancet is one of the most venerated medical publications in the world. Here, we have a statement published in The Lancet in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. And they say, underlined in blue, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." What on earth is a statement from scientists appearing in The Lancet even bringing up the idea of conspiracy theories? One must ask oneself, how is that possible? natural origin versus lab origin, that is a legitimate scientific debate. That's not a conspiracy theory. And one has to wonder how they can be sure that the virus did not come from a lab. This came out in February of 2020, February 19th, 2020. February. There's been no, how much research was done on the virus up to that point? Almost none. Very, very reminiscent of President Bush, who 2 months after 9/11 were condemning anyone who suggested that there could be another explanation, condemned them as a conspiracy theorist. He said this at the United Nations before the cleanup at Ground Zero had even been completed. What we see here is the same exact thing. The idea that an alternative explanation could be true is immediately struck down as a conspiracy theory. Very, very eerie and very concerning. Creating a climate of fear from an elusive enemy. We saw that in 9/11. Now, here we have an image that many of us will see as all too familiar. Every single day, an endless barrage of COVID-19 deaths on mainstream media. This is when we hit 1 million fatalities back in May of this year. 1 million COVID-19 deaths? Are you sure? I would like to show you this. This is the Illinois Director of Public Health, who made this statement in a press conference in March of 2020. She is asked how the government is determining whether a death is caused by COVID-19 or with COVID-19, and this is what she says.
Definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
How clear can you be? Now, let's be very direct here. First of all, I applaud the doctor for her forthrightness. And the other thing I want to point out here is this shouldn't be some incredible revelation to us, okay? Because our government has to do it this way, because determining the true cause of anyone's death is not easy to do. To think that we have enough people on the CDC and the FDA to go through every death certificate and pull apart, which ones are from COVID, which ones are with COVID, is not possible. That is impossible. It is clear that that's what the approach had to be back then, and now this admission that's over 2 years old for some reason gets lost. That's what we're doing. It is absolutely certain that this approach is going to inflate the number of COVID-19 deaths. And by COVID-19 deaths, I'm talking about deaths from COVID-19. Did you hear what she said? You could be in a hospice with just a few weeks to live and you die. And if you have a positive COVID test, that's a COVID death. You could die from a completely unrelated cause, but if you happen to test positive for COVID, it's a COVID death. So the idea that that there's an inflation of the COVID deaths is a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. We have our own government officials telling us that that's what they're doing. Creating a climate of fear. Now, early on in the pandemic, a mathematical model by Neil Ferguson that led to the extreme measures that our government took assumed in his model that that the disease could be spread for 4.6 days while asymptomatic after getting exposed, and it did not account for any protective benefit of natural immunity. That means that the pool to which the disease can reinfect people remains much larger than it does. So this led to extreme exaggerations of the potential death counts from the virus. This is what justified lockdowns and mandates. Anyone and everyone was a potential threat, from this idea of asymptomatic spread, including family members. I look at 9/11 as a way to divide countries and, religious ideologies, Christian from fundamentalist Muslim, and, us from them. This narrative was designed to separate families and neighbors. That's what it did. We have to ask ourselves, was that the intention? Whether or not you agree with that, we must agree that that was the result. How else was fear generated? There wasn't any treatment or cure. Our only hope was to wait for a vaccine, right? That's what we were told. No treatment or cure? What does this man have to say? This is Pierre Corey, a highly published and respected critical care physician, giving congressional testimony in December of 2020. What do you think he has to say here? Let's watch.
That we have a solution to this crisis. There is a drug that is proving to be of miraculous impact. And when I say miracle, I do not use that term lightly. And I don't want to be sensationalized when I say that. That is a scientific recommendation based on mountains of data that has emerged in the last 3 months. When I am told, and I just had to hear this in the opening sentence, that we are touting things that are not FDA or NIH recommended, let me be clear. The NIH, their recommendation on ivermectin, which is to not use it outside of controlled trials, is from August 27th. We are now in December. This is 3 to 4 months later. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus.
It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. The NIH, as you said, is only approving the use of ivermectin in controlled trials. And that was based on data that was based on a statement coming from August in 2020. Now, here we are 2 years later, and the NIH's position on it has not changed. Here is a synopsis of all the studies of ivermectin in the early treatment and prophylaxis of COVID-19. It's comprehensive. And in order to interpret this slide, you have to see that on the right, there's a bunch of green and red dots. Where there's a green one, that is a study that demonstrated that ivermectin was superior to placebo in the early treatment and prophylaxis studies. These are all of the studies that are available as of September 2022. Why has the NIH not changed their position on ivermectin? In my mind, this is the greatest insult and most diabolical maneuver that our government, and by our government I'm talking about the FDA and the CDC, has waged against us. This disease was treatable. It still is. But these kinds of treatments were silenced and unapproved, and those who treated patients were vilified. The other early treatment and treatment of COVID was hydroxychloroquine. Now, the reason why hydroxychloroquine was dismissed was a huge study involving almost 100,000 patients was published in The Lancet. And that study apparently showed that those who were treated with hydroxychloroquine not only not have a benefit, but they had a harm from hydroxychloroquine over placebo. And that was used to scuttle the entire discussion on hydroxychloroquine. But just a few weeks later, the Lancet had to retract their study on hydroxychloroquine, citing the fact that their data was corrupt, or they could not find the data. And the subheading here, a first-year statistics major, could tell you about major flaws in the design of the analysis. Now, what does this mean? This is the Lancet, as I said, one of the most respected medical publications in the world. It was peer-reviewed, and the data was corrupt. How is this possible? This is a demonstration of the abuse of science again. What people rely upon is the peer review process. And if the peer review process is ineffective, then what do we have to go on? I don't know. We have to go on our own wits. That's what we're left with right now. But this is the abuse of science at the very deepest level. Why would they want to destroy alternative treatment? Well, if you're hopeless, it generates a compliance to authority. People become more willing to accept a vaccine despite no FDA approval. But more importantly, emergency use authorization stipulates that there must be no alternative treatment that is safe and effective. If there was a safe and effective treatment for COVID-19, they could not have authorized the vaccine. This is a very, very important point to remember as we pull apart what's happening here. They could not have acknowledged ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine if they wanted to push the vaccine through. The response is worse than the problem, okay? Just like 9/11, the endless wars. What's this? This is a cumulative summary of vaccine adverse event reports in VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, from 1990 to 2022. As we can see here, everything is pretty much quiescent, and then kaboom, in 2021, we see an explosion of adverse event reports, as well as in 2022. Now, if that wasn't enough, a CDC-funded study in 2010, it's called the Lazarus study, written by Ross Lazarus, did a deep dive into the underreporting of vaccine adverse events in the Harvard Pilgrim health system, and fewer, he found, than 1% of vaccine adverse events are reported. 1%. That means we must multiply everything in the VAERS system by a factor of 100. Well, that's what the data shows. That's what a CDC-funded study shows. Before we get too excited about multiplying everything in VAERS by a factor of 100, we have to be a little bit more thoughtful in how we approach this problem. We're faced with the difficult task of trying to understand what is not being reported. That's what we mean by the underreporting factor. So when we say that the underreporting factor is 100, like the CDC study showed us, the Lazarus study, they were looking at adverse events of all kinds. But here we want to be very clear. We're looking for serious adverse events, something as serious as death. And it is very logical to say relatively innocuous adverse events are not going to be reported anywhere near the frequency as very serious adverse events, like death. The reality is it's not so easy to fill out a VAERS report. And many of these adverse events are chalked up to reactogenicity, or what you would expect from a vaccine being injected into your arm, like malaise, having a fever for a day or two, a headache. So how are we to know how many deaths are not being reported? It seems like an impossible question to answer, but it actually isn't. One way to do this is to look at the incidence of a serious adverse event with the COVID-19 vaccination at estimate its incidence, and then look and see what is being reported in VAERS for the very same adverse event. And probably the most reasonable adverse event specifically to examine here is anaphylaxis, which is an acute allergic reaction that follows the administration of a vaccine. And the reason why this is an important adverse event to consider is that it is unquestionably due to the vaccine, because this generally happens within a few minutes after getting vaccinated. So there'll be very little doubt in the practitioner's mind or in the patient's mind that their response was due to the vaccine. So it will eliminate any doubt whatsoever that, well, maybe it wasn't due to the vaccine. Maybe it was due to something else. No, it was due to the vaccine. And what we see here is that there was a study that was done right here in Boston, and it was written up in JAMA, the journal for the American Medical Association, back in March of 2021. And they inoculated about 64,000 of their healthcare workers, healthcare professionals. And they recorded the number of true cases of anaphylaxis following the COVID-19 vaccine administration. And after injecting 64,000 of their employees, they found that 16 had true anaphylaxis by all biochemical markers. Now, 16 in 64,000 is approximately 250 in a million. That is the incidence of anaphylaxis following COVID-19 vaccination. 250 in a million. What is the reported rate of anaphylaxis in VAERS? Well, that number is about 5.5 in a million. 5.5 in a million versus 250 in a million. So we're looking at a underreporting factor for anaphylaxis to be about 40. Now, this is a very good correlative or a correlate with death for a number of reasons. The first is that it's very serious. Your life was threatened at the time. And second, it is reasonable to think that anaphylaxis is going to be reported more than death. And the reason for that is it is unequivocally due to the vaccine, because the adverse event occurs within minutes. This is not so true with death when it happens after inoculation. It could happen in a day or much longer. So we would expect then that the underreporting for anaphylaxis is going to be less than death. So when we use a underreporting factor of approximately 40 with respect to anaphylaxis, we are being very conservative when we apply that to vaccine-associated deaths. Now, when we use an underreporting factor of 40 and we look at what VAERS is showing us now in terms of reported deaths after vaccination in the United States, it's somewhere around 14,000 right now as of September 2022. That puts us into a very uncomfortable territory. 40 times 14 is something like 560,000 deaths that may have been caused by the vaccine. Now, 560,000 lives lost. Of course, these are not investigated, but don't you think at this point that an investigation is warranted? Why is there no real investigation into both the lab origins as well as the vaccine adverse event injuries that are reported in VAERS? Why not? This is a plot of myocarditis following injection with the vaccine. This was a presentation given to the FDA's advisory panel, and what we see here is that in most situations with myocarditis, the symptoms appeared within a few days after the injection and then trailed off as time went on. This relationship, this temporal relationship with injection and symptoms, is a hallmark of causality, which is why it's being investigated. We hear about myocarditis, that's the risk, right? this is the same graph, but now we're looking at deaths. It's the same pattern. The same hallmark of causality is present with deaths following vaccination. It peaks at the second day and then trails off. Why aren't they being investigated? What else is going wrong here? Why is there no investigation to this? Here's another remarkable finding, and you have to dig deep into the COVID stuff to find this. This is coming out of the vaccine trial, the Pfizer trial, and there is enormous evidence of negligence or malfeasance here. What I'm showing you here is that on the left and on the right was a memorandum sent between Pfizer and the FDA in support of their application for emergency use authorization, on the left with the adults and on the right with children. And what we see here, if you can look closely, is that at a certain point in the trial, all of a sudden you see a much larger number of participants dropping out of the trial if they got the vaccine. When did this happen? It happened within 7 days of the second dose. They say it's an important protocol deviation, but the protocol was applicable to both the placebo and the vaccine group. They had the same protocol. It was a blinded study. So why did 5 times more people pull out of the study within 7 days of the second vaccination if they got the vaccine, but not the placebo? Could it have been an adverse event that made those participants unable to continue in the trial? It's very possible. It is very, very possible. But this points to the fact that there is no investigation. Why didn't the FDA ask about it? Now, if you think that was shocking to begin with, the very same thing happened in the pediatric trial on the right. Here we have 6 times more, 3.1% versus 0.5% of kids unable to continue in the trial after getting the second dose. Within 7 days, 6 times more kids pulled out of the vaccine group than the placebo group. This is an enormous problem because it points to a number of things, including the potential unblinding of the investigators, but it also points to the fact that if, let's say, with the adults, there were about 240 or 250 more vaccine recipients that pulled out. 250 out of about 20,000 is just over 1%. If we attribute those to serious adverse events, something really bad happened after the vaccine, that means that we should be seeing a 1% or so incidence of serious adverse events after the vaccine is given. So this would corroborate with the enormous number of vaccine injuries that are being reported in VAERS. With 1% serious adverse event, that means if you give the vaccine to 100 million people, you will see 1 million serious adverse events. If you give it to 200 million people, you will see 2 million serious adverse events. So when we're seeing millions of adverse events being reported in VAERS, it is completely unfair to just dismiss it as, well, they're not confirmed or investigated. True, they're not, but why aren't we investigating them? Why isn't there a sincere investigation by our public health agencies into the very same reporting systems that are supposed to tip us off that there's a problem? The trial predicted that many, and we're seeing that many, but no one's doing anything. Media censorship. Control of the COVID-19 narrative. Okay. Now, let's be very clear here. The media is not going to report that they're being controlled. So if you go off and do a Google search, is the media being controlled? They're not going to report it, right? We have to deduce it. You have to ask yourself, like, why are experts like Dr. Pierre Corey, who you just heard, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Meryl Nass, never given a voice on mainstream media? Instead, the public is told that the dissenting opinion is only held by anti-vaxxers and uneducated laypersons. They'll bring on a a person who is speaking in earnest but does not have the credentials, and their position is attacked. It's a strawman argument that they take down and then they move on. That's what they're doing. The media. Why would a philanthropist like Bill Gates need to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to media outlets? Philanthropists usually don't have to buy good press coverage, right? At least that's my experience. The fact-checking, the relentless fact-checking. Joe, you're aware of these entities. Who's funding them? Like, are we really supposed to accept the fact that there are a bunch of independent researchers who have the wherewithal and time to go after any quote-unquote misinformation to prove it wrong and liberate the public from this kind of deception? You think they're doing it for free? Who is paying them? Well, there you have it. Why is the book The Real Anthony Fauci, which has sold over 1 million copies, can't be found on the New York Times bestseller list? The book, as you know, is written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and it is a scathing indictment of the system, including Dr. Anthony Fauci. It is a must-read, and the book speaks for itself. The point is, why isn't the Times promoting such a phenomenal book? Control of information by powerful entities. Here we have a real problem, a massive conflict of interest. The biopharmaceutical, Forbes reports this, 75% of the FDA's drug review budget. What does this mean? The FDA is supposed to regulate the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry is providing 75% of the funding for the FDA. What could possibly go wrong? Who is controlling the narrative, right? Who do they hire? The firm Hill and Knowlton. Do we remember this from Rich's presentation? This very same firm. Philip Zelikow leads the COVID Commission Planning Group. The former director of the 9/11 Commission is now leading the COVID Commission Planning Group. More conflicts of interest. Now, the reason why I posted this is that this is an article from May 2021 where Bill Gates was pushed to release or relinquish some of the patents that he has on COVID-19 vaccines, and he chose to make that move. The point here is that this man and his foundation owns the patents on some of the COVID-19 vaccines. He's also a huge funder of the media and of our public health agencies. Is our media telling us the truth? Let's take a listen to this. Maybe you've seen this before.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer. CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer. This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
So I'm not going to belabor this. It goes on for another 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The point here is that Pfizer, among the other pharmaceutical for-profit companies, are paying for the news. No matter how you fall on what side of this argument you fall upon, that is undeniable. And that is a conflict of interest that must be taken into consideration whenever you accept or reject what a media source is telling you. Their control of the narrative through mainstream media is extensive. No one can argue with that. Now, I want to finish with this statement. Although numerous players have been involved in creating the false narratives around 9/11, we as a free people rely on a free press to hold tyrannical powers in check. Ultimately, the media needs to be held accountable. Now, I'm talking about 9/11, but I'm also talking about COVID-19. We have to understand that we believe that we're free. Why do we believe that we're free? We believe that we're free and immune from this kind of tyrannical control because we believe that the media is going to hold tyranny in check. Are they doing their job? In my mind, they absolutely have not been doing their job. They didn't ask a single question about Building 7 21 years ago. They destroyed any person who brought up a lab origins hypothesis. They destroyed physicians who wanted to treat their patients with ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. The parallels are uncanny. It is the free press that is the biggest conspirator in all of this.
So yet another fascinating look at these parallels here, Madhava, as you went through the COVID side of this. As you pointed out in the end, the media is the common denominator here. This is the piece where we've learnt as the public, so to speak, the narrative of both of these stories. And because the media per se, and this isn't about blame, but it's about just understanding what's going on. Because the media per se isn't doing their job to challenge that governmental narrative. I mean, that's what the media is there for, right? To look at what government is doing and hold them to account. But because that's not happening, and they appear to just be going along with all of the facts, if you will, of these narratives, it's come down to different professionals, independent people like us, to have to look through and try and figure out these particular things and all the facts that go along with it, which is obviously not an ideal situation. But I'm curious, Richard, with all that said, looking at how you just saw this presentation on the COVID side now, what are some of your thoughts and feelings as we wrap this here?
I was blown away. I think Madhava just hit it out of the park. I mean, he talked about foreknowledge of these of different aspects of COVID. He talked about drills again that were set up in advance. And we have this powerful, elusive enemy that he highlighted so well, a climate of fear that was created. I mean, just to hear this again in this complete 20 years later, after 9/11, all of it, the extreme control of information and practices by powerful state agencies, the abuse of science all over again in the pandemic, the responses that are far more harmful than the original problem, with so many thousands and hundreds of thousands of people dying, as it turns out, beyond the numbers presented just by VAERS. There's no real investigation of these, certainly Fauci's gain of function research and the rest of it. The false official accounts that we've been given, the lying, the exaggeration of statistics, the denying of the causes of medications that could have really helped people, but instead benefited rich people with suspicious benefits who are insiders directly controlling policy. And then the media censorship. I mean, I'm blown away by the incredible depth and breadth across the world of the major mainstream media and government and most all of the countries. How did this happen, this level of control? I mean, Joe, this is extremely scary stuff. And I don't know how you get a grip on it after seeing it all in perspective like this from 9/11 to COVID. It's overwhelming.
Indeed. And, I think the interesting part of this is that, after 9/11, we had a deep questioning as a result of that collective event. We had a deep questioning amongst people who were now saying, why am I going to trust authority when there's so many holes in the narratives that they're giving us around these major events? And when, as you pointed out, so beautifully in this presentation, they're not willing to do the investigation in the key details that require that extra investigation. And then coming into COVID, we see this already primed audience, if you will, who are saying, well, because I have lost a sense of trust, right? We hear this over and over and over again from the mainstream, from different academics who are trying to understand our culture at the moment. And they're saying things like, it appears as though we have a culture whereby people are no longer trusting their institutions, right? The faith in institutions is going down, and they're suggesting that the explanation for this is just conspiracy theory, right? People are believing bad ideas, and therefore they're losing their faith in institutions. But I think there's a lot more to that, and I think we've seen it here, and I think COVID-19 is presenting yet another example of how these events are waking up collective consciousness, if you will. And Madhava, I think you've said multiple times, and I'd love to get your take on this, is, all of these events are, always acting as a catalyst, particularly for us to continue expanding the way we think about things. What do you see now that, COVID is sort of winding down in a sense? What do you see potentially happening in the coming years as we continue to look at this story?
I think it's going to be very, very important for people like us who are digging deep and have a platform to spread what we believe is what's going on, to make sure people understand that our message is very hopeful. It's not one that paints a dystopian picture of the world, but we always need to remember that we need to envision what this world would look like if the boot that is on our throat right now were identified and removed. How free would we be? We've forgotten what it's like to be free. We're taking off our shoes at the airport while wearing masks now. What is going on? And if we don't argue our side with the idea that we have something to be hopeful for, if we would just come together and look at the evidence together, it's going to be a hard battle to fight. And we also have to realize that, there are two sides to this. And the reason why I'm saying that is possibly one of the biggest hindrances in people understanding what's really going on here is the magnitude of the lie. If it was a small lie or even a medium-sized lie, we could say, oh, yeah, wow, they're really a bunch of jerks out there, and, someone should bring them to task. But, blowing up 3 skyscrapers on a sunny Tuesday morning in the middle of Manhattan, just condemning all of those innocent lives to that kind of finality, and then the millions of deaths, as Richard pointed out, that followed in the $6.5 trillion war machine that got mobilized for no apparent reason. I mean, it's inconceivable. And, COVID-19, in terms of the toll it's taken on humanity, is no less. We're talking about millions of deaths, and we don't even know right now what the casualties of our response is going to be. So the point here I'm trying to make is that it is sometimes hard for people to understand that could have actually happened because it's so large. We can't see it because it's so big.
Yeah, indeed. Richard, any final thoughts here as another anniversary of 9/11 is upon us?
I'm picking up where Madhava left off, and he sees hope here. And I painted a bleak picture, but I also do see hope. And what is that hope? That hope is waking people up on the COVID side to 9/11, because many of them are waking up to COVID, right? Millions of Americans are in the medical truth and freedom movement. And on the 9/11 side, there's many who are starting to wake up, I would say, maybe half, I don't know, woken up to the manipulations of COVID and its rather evil response, as we've seen, or the response to it. We can use people in 9/11 will be listening to this event, people in the 9/11 Truth Movement, and learning a whole lot, as I have from Madhava, about the medical manipulations here. This starts a new movement, I think, the 9/11 COVID Truth Movement, and we're going to cross-pollinate, and it's going to grow. So that gives me a whole lot of hope also, the rate at which people are waking up. We just need this cross-pollination. And I've been at it for 16 years now, and there's something inside of me that's way bigger than I am, driving and pushing forward relentlessly. It's not just that I'm angry about having been manipulated and lied to. I'm having joy in my 9/11 Truth activism, a lot of it. And I enjoy meeting large groups of people and individuals all across the country and around the world. And I feel like I'm backed up, not just by them, but something that we're all backed up by, and something that we're riding the wave of, and we're heading somewhere. And we don't see the end. We don't see how far up the hill we still have to push this huge rock. But I'm feeling that it's not forever. I'm feeling that it's coming in a year or two. I don't know where I get that information, but I'm increasingly hopeful. How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting aspects of this whole thing and you pointed it out, is sort of this unifying message, seeing some of the parallels between these narratives, understanding that in a world where we're so divided by almost everything, really, there's so many aspects to the human experience that we're being invited to allow to divide us. We're ending here on almost a unifying message, seeing where unity comes together to ultimately produce, I think, the changes and the type of world that we all see and feel is possible. And in the spirit of that, I mean, look, we came together for this particular event, the COVID side, the 9/11 side, unifying to create a presentation to, sort of discuss this entire thing. And in the spirit of that, I want to thank both of you for, coming on and sharing your expertise and your insight in all of this. It's been a pleasure to both hear all of the evidence, but also, have these types of conversations of kind of understanding what do these events mean for us as people, and what are they going to mean for us moving forward. So thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much for taking the time to explore this presentation with us. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, give the video a like, and pass it along to your friends and family. Take care, and we'll see you next time.